Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Behnam Taleblu. He's with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is their senior fellow. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you, and happy belated Thanksgiving to you and your viewers.
Thank you for that. As far as your organization, remind people about the organization and the role it takes, or the positioning it takes when it talks about issues of foreign affairs.
Sure. So FDD was founded shortly after 9/11, almost at that point exclusively focusing on the Middle East and terrorism issues, and then has broadened out over the past 2 decades to cover other foreign policy issues: Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, cyber, great power competition, military issues. It takes a broadly internationalist, perhaps more interventionist stance towards foreign policy. Some have said hawkish. I don't think that's bad or good. I just think it's a little bit more of an objective label, but also you could say that the organization favors more engagement rather than pulling away or isolation in select theaters around the world.
And as far as how the organization is funded, how would you describe that?
Sure. So it's a 501c3. It's a nonprofit. You can look at the funding online. It takes funding from Americans, and it's proud to not take any foreign government funding.
You talk about the matters of engagement when it comes to the point of view and at least the approach you take. One of the issues of engagement coming up next week deals with Iran over its nuclear program. Can you describe what's expected next Monday?
So next Monday has been a period of anticipation that has built up for quite some time. Just by way of background, there were 6 rounds of indirect nuclear diplomacy involving the U.S. and the European powers and other parties to this 2015 nuclear deal called the JCPOA, which the U.S. left in May 2018 under the former administration of Donald Trump. Since then, the Trump administration had a policy of maximum pressure. The Biden administration has tried something you could say drastically different. Between April and June, July of 2021, there were 6 rounds of indirect diplomacy. There was no resumption of that 2015 nuclear deal. So this is the first time since Iran has had a new president since midsummer, late summer, where it's had a new ultra-hardline president, a new ultra-hardline cabinet, that the prospects for diplomacy have been re-upped. So many people are looking at what Iran's opening position will be, what Iran's bottom line will be. But if you're looking at what they're saying in their own press, in the Persian language space, they've taken an exceptionally hardline stance towards these negotiations, despite all of the nuclear violations and nuclear escalations thus far by the Islamic Republic of Iran. In fact, they're saying they don't want to talk about the nuclear issue. They explicitly only want to talk about sanctions relief. And that'll be a very tough circle to square, both indirectly for the Biden administration and directly for the Europeans, who are motivated by non-proliferation or counter-proliferation motives towards Tehran. You know, this year Iran has done things in nuclear space that they've threatened to do about a decade ago, but never actually felt comfortable doing. One example of that is enrichment at high levels to 60% purity, which is just a hop, skip, and jump to weapons-grade uranium, which is 90%.
Was that in direct reaction for the previous administration pulling out of the deal and as far as advancing that work?
It's a great question because Iran, despite having its contest against America under both Republican and Democratic presidents, has had a somewhat clear policy since the U.S. left the nuclear deal in 2018. You could say during the first year, 2018 to 2019, it had a policy of what you could call strategic patience, where it thought, like many analysts in Washington thought, and some European and Asian banks and businesses thought, that Washington's unilateral sanctions could not create the same kind of macroeconomic pain that multilaterally had been built up a decade prior. Once they saw they were wrong, and within 1 year's time, or just over 1 year's time, the U.S. could recreate it and recreate it at such speed, the Iranians moved from a policy of strategic patience to what I like to call graduated escalation. Graduated escalation had 2 parts. It was pretty significant in the region. If you remember the summer of 2019, there were multiple flashpoints per conflict between the U.S. and Iran in the Persian Gulf and the maritime domain, a resumption of rocket attacks against positions in Iraq, and then gradually, very publicly unwinding the nuclear deal, talking about how its actions were reversible. But really, with the election of Joe Biden in November 2020, U.S. domestic politics being on full display at the end of 2020, the change in administration, the U.S. was shifting from a policy of maximum pressure to what you could call maximum deference under the Biden administration, or under the incoming Biden administration. And so despite the softer line by the Biden team, Iran actually ramped up its nuclear program and its regional escalation. And it went from what we like to call graduated escalation to overt or gross or significant escalation. And since then, it's done things like enrich uranium to 20% purity, something it had suspended previously, begin enriching uranium to 60% purity, a historical first, developing uranium metal, which has weapons applications and the regime has no immediate nuclear need for, and really seriously phase in advanced centrifuges and really seriously begin to impede and hamper the scope and the axis of the International Atomic Energy Agency inside Iran. And given all this nuclear history, that's why many have their eyes on November 29th as a way to try to put Iran's nuclear program back in the box.
Our guest with us until about 9:40, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans and Independents, 202-748-8002. You can text us at 202-748-8003. When it comes to Monday, will the U.S. be directly involved in these talks?
So the way the previous rounds of talks have been phased, you could say, is indirect diplomacy. And that's a term that administration had to come up with because by it no longer being a party to the JCPOA, it would have the Europeans shuttle back and forth between the Iranians and the other remaining members of the P5+1. Those members were, of course, the Russians and the Chinese. So it's assumed that that same role of the European interlocutor will continue, unless the press reports something differently.
As far as this round, then, what's expected to happen? Give us the expected day, so to speak.
So November 29th is the day that they'll actually meet in Vienna. That's the day of engagement. In the past, sometimes these rounds go on for 3, 4, 5 days. Usually they'll end to agree to meet again. My gut assumption is that you might have one more meeting before the end of 2021. But really during these 3 or 4 days, we'll learn a lot about the Iranian position. For instance, we said that the outgoing government in Iran of Hassan Rouhani, which left this summer, had 6 rounds of indirect nuclear diplomacy. Will the current new ultra-hardline government begin where the Rouhani administration left off? Will they tear up all that progress altogether? What will they do? This is an opening question. Another interesting opening question is how firmly will they hold some of the public red lines that the supreme leader of Iran, that's, as you know, a title meant to be taken very literally. The supreme leader's name is Ali Khamenei. He's in charge of the country's foreign and security policy. He's the ultimate arbiter of major matters. So he's the one who will really give them a green light to press ahead or not. We'll see how much leeway he's given these new team of negotiators. But we should keep our eyes on the prize here. That as Washington is trying very, very hard to get back into this deal, it's unfortunately let some enforcement of existing penalties that are on the books slip. So Iran, even though it has not met yet with the U.S., or this new administration has not met with the Europeans, has been watching what the U.S. is doing, has been drawing inferences about the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, for instance, about the lack of enforcement of existing penalties. And it's trying to make assumptions as to how firm the U.S. commitments are to go to what many have called a plan B in case these talks, after 3, 4, 5 days, after 1 or 2 rounds, collapse.
I'll take you back in time a little bit. This is late August. The president is meeting just before his first meeting with the Israeli prime minister, talking about Iran's nuclear ambitions. I'll play you what he had to say back then, talk to you about it on the flip side.
And we're also going to discuss the threat from Iran and our commitment to ensure Iran never develops a nuclear weapon. But we're putting diplomacy first and seeing where that takes us. But if diplomacy fails, we're ready to turn to other options. We'll support Israel's developing deeper ties as well with the Arab and Muslim neighbors and globally.
So that said, how do you interpret that?
So that was actually a very neat, very natural follow-on to that other term I just used, Plan B. Many have been, since that August, talking about what is America's Plan B, what is Europe's Plan B, what is Israel's Plan B, and what is Iran's Plan B if these negotiations don't pan out in a certain way. And again, there is a lot of reason for skepticism given how firm the Iranians have held some of these red lines in the past before they've come into negotiations, and of course their desire to extract premature concessions. They really do want to spite, you could say, the great Satan in their parlance, or they want to spite the United States of America. Just before we get into that Plan B discussion, just a reminder, why is Iran holding out for so long? Well, not only is it emboldened by the lack of current enforcement of some of these sanctions and some of the inferences it's been making about will the Biden administration push back on Iran-backed proxies in places like Iraq or Syria or Yemen, for instance, but also it believes that its plan B, its escalation options are more serious, and it's more comfortable doing them than America's plan B and America's escalation options. We know many, for instance, who became part of the Biden cabinet, who were initially part of the Biden campaign, who were major foreign policy figures in the Democratic establishment under the period of the Donald Trump presidency, had been denigrating the U.S.-Iran policy then, had been highly critical of U.S. sanctions then. So it's a very odd position for Biden to be talking about more pressure when many of his staff had actually been denigrating pressure. And in a sense, they have forgotten how the 2013 nuclear deal and 2015 nuclear deal came about, which was through U.S. and EU and UN pressure. So this is one reason why Iran has been increasingly comfortable with escalation. Now, when Biden talks about Plan B, he talked about diplomacy first. And you see that in the behavior of the Biden administration. It does not believe that coercive diplomacy, or meaning sanctions or pressure and diplomacy, can exist at the same time. That's why several times in 2021, despite that broad array of nuclear violations I had just discussed earlier on the show, the U.S. and its European partners did not censure, meaning simply pass a resolution of condemnation and criticism of Iran's nuclear advances, nuclear violations, and impediments of things and agreements much more important to the non-proliferation regime than the JCPOA. It believed that any kind of pressure would push Iran further away from the table rather than bring it to the table. To me, that's an incorrect lesson, but that's the way the administration had been acting. So it has talked a lot about a closing window. You can see this in quotes. It's talked a lot about a diminishing runway, a closing door for diplomacy. But the administration hasn't shut it just yet. And one reason is it's increasingly uncomfortable, per that Iranian assessment, of moving to these more pressure-based options, whether that's deployments of troops to the region, tightening of military ties in the region, a resumption of the sanctions policy. And the Iranians know that, and that's why they're trying to extract as much as they can up front.
Let's hear from Grant, Washington, D.C., independent live for Behnam Taleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Grant, good morning. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd just like to remind Americans that the greatest blow against the nuclear non-proliferation regime occurred back in the 1960s after Israel went nuclear, despite the intense efforts of the Kennedy administration to inspect the Dimona nuclear weapons production facility and tackle the extremely destabilizing threat that Israel presents, not only to the region, but to the world. Jimmy Carter acknowledged that Israel has over 100 nuclear weapons, and it's actually illegal under the Symington and Glenn amendments to the foreign aid laws to give aid to nuclear countries outside the NPT. So I'd like to encourage people to call their members of Congress to block aid until the question of Israel's nuclear weapons is dealt with.
That's Grant in Washington, D.C. Mr. Ben Taleblu, hello. Go ahead.
Yes. So there are many interesting books written on Israel's program, Israel's nuclear aspirations. One very famous academic work by Avner Cohen I would recommend to the reader to take perhaps a more nuanced look at in the region. But I would highly disagree with the framing of the threat in the region. You know, when Iran, back not under the current regime, but previously under the Shah, for instance, in the pre-1979 era, had been developing weapons aspirations. It had been developing a civilian nuclear program with these potential weapons off-roads. According to U.S. intelligence, per a special national security directive, if I'm not mistaken, their assessment of the Shah's aspirations were status-driven and really in response to what was going on in South Asia, rather than the period under the Carter and Kennedy administration that the caller had spoken about. Moreover, I think it's just interesting to note in the past few years what you've seen with the Abraham Accords, what you've seen with the tightening of ties really between Israel and some of the other more traditional U.S. partners in the region, some of the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, UAE, Bahrain, formally, Saudi informally, as well as other states that have had normalization agreements with Israel, that nuclear issue is not necessarily the outsized issue that the caller has made it out to be. And in fact, many of these states have been able to put aside their differences, given the 800-pound elephant in the room, which is a rising revisionist Islamic Republic of Iran, and one that could potentially be nuclear armed.
The New York Times reporting of the lead up to this said this about Israel's role, as they report, saying American officials warning their Israeli counterparts that repeated attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities may be tactically satisfying, but they are ultimately counterproductive, according to several officials with behind-the-scenes discussions. Israeli officials saying they have no intention of letting up. How does that affect what goes on Monday and forward when it comes to this larger discussion of Iran's nuclear program?
So there are very different approaches taken to counterproliferation efforts by the U.S. and Israel. The U.S. has traditionally preferred, at least vis-a-vis what we know publicly, the Iranian nuclear program. It's preferred more diplomacy, more talk, and then when it comes to pressure, lots of sanctions, unilateral, multilateral, bilateral, and then only selectively acts of sabotage. You know, it has export controls, but things like the Stuxnet attack, other sorts of forms of pressure. But when you look at the string of assassinations, or more recently, of course, the summer of nuclear sabotage, the summer of 2020, when many of Iran's nuclear facilities, and some even military facilities, by the way, were subject to cyber attacks or other sorts of explosions, many had pointed a finger to other foreign intelligence services. Many of those people pointed the finger at Israel, looking at these kind of counterproliferation options as Israel trying to make Iran fight with one arm tied behind its back. So tying that to the New York Times story, I think that those unnamed U.S. officials who were sharing that bit of information probably read these sorts of efforts of counterproliferation as spurring Iran to continue somehow further rather than hindering their program. I think each one can be subject to a technical debate or a different technical assessment.
This is a viewer off of Twitter, Parkstorm, saying, why would Iran negotiate with the United States when another Republican can just get elected and throw out any agreements?
That actually is a very excellent point. But to take us way back to 2015, if I'm not mistaken, it was then Senator Tom Cotton had written something of an open letter or an op-ed, I can't recall the format, to Iran, reminding them that the way this nuclear agreement was being finalized was in such a manner that a future U.S. administration could easily withdraw, because it was an executive agreement, it wasn't a treaty. Technically, the document is not even signed. So in this sense, the caller is right to say that unless this thing is finalized in the form of a treaty, then there is, of course, going to be an impetus to withdraw. I think the way things are shaping up domestically, and I'm no domestic politics expert, but living and breathing in Washington, it is clear that a withdrawal of the JCPOA or withdrawal of whatever agreement that the Biden administration is going to get, if that agreement is not in the form of a treaty, is very much going to be in the cards of any kind of future Republican presidency. Now, how does Iran factor into this? Quite simply, Iran in that case should be incentivized to actually come clean, should be incentivized to actually do a full deal. Otherwise, they can expect more continuing seesaws between different administrations and partisan politics in Washington. It's a shame, unfortunately, that the Iran issue has become partisan. There was a time, perhaps about a decade ago, that it really wasn't, especially on Capitol Hill. But those days are long gone, and our adversaries understand that.
From Brett, Searchlight, Nevada, Independent Line.
Yes, sir. You've been talking about Israel, but after when the Democrats pulled that funding from the Iron Curtain, I'm not sure if they put it back in, and they did it anyways. How much patience do you believe that Israel will have with Iran on their nuclear proliferation, and how much pull do you think the Biden administration would have?
I think the caller asks a very important question, which is really, what's Israel's red line here for military pressure and military action on Iran? And I want to divide out two segments of the Iran threat for our callers. One is Iran in the region, and one is Iran's nuclear program in their own home. So Iran in the region, you've seen actually the Israelis for many years now do significant operations inside Syrian territory against facilities where Lebanese Hezbollah, Iran's chief proxy, is present, against facilities where the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its elite Quds force are present. So Israel has really been trying to hold back the wave of Iran-backed proxies and Iran-backed militias, which are slowly beginning to come up towards Israel's borders. There is something of a strategy that the regime has. We like to call it a land bridge in Washington, which is a contiguous amount of territory between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon that allows the regime to exert power through this land corridor into the Eastern Mediterranean. So militarily, that red line's already been crossed, and Israel has already been working on pushing back on that kinetically. You see that with all the reports coming out of Syria. On the nuclear file, for instance, this is really an open question. There are some who say the fact that Israel has been talking about it so much means that at present it may not have the capability to do the type of operation there that it did in Iraq in 1981 or it did in Syria in 2007. However, we should think about what the Iranians are thinking about here, because they still see high levels of Israeli capability, again, to combat Iran's proxies, and high levels of Israeli resolve, willingness to go through these escalation ladders to combat Iran's proxies, to continue these counter-proliferation operations and other types of information and intelligence operations. Ultimately, the Iranians still, in my view, feel more deterred at the moment by the potential for some sort of Israeli military action, because I think with the withdrawal of Afghanistan and the desire of multiple U.S. presidents on the left and the right to leave the region, you can say there is less of a direct U.S. military deterrent to Iran going into a weapons state. And just as by way of background for our callers, prior to 2002, with the seizure of the Israeli nuclear archive that tells us what was going on in the past about Iran's weapons program, Iran initially wanted a crash program for up to 5 nuclear weapons. This stuff is now public. This stuff is now well known. It's entered the public domain. But really, it was the U.S. invasion of Iraq and other things that gave the halt order or the pause order and the restructuring of Iran's nuclear program, covert and overt, potential civilian and potential weapon, that gives you the shape and the scale and the scope of the program that you have today. So ultimately, that was the moment of Iran being deterred by potential U.S. military pressure. Now that that is being rolled back, Israel is the next outsized capable state, and no one really knows what that red line would be.
Behnam Taleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy is with us for our discussion. We'll hear from Ben. Ben is in Crystal River, Florida, on our line for Republicans. Ben, good morning. Go ahead, you're on.
Good morning. I'd like to know, given you're given a good history of everything that transpired as of now, let's talk about a hypothetical. You have control of this situation. You personally, how would you counter Iran from today going forward?
Well, I forgot who said this. I think it was William F. Buckley Jr. when he ran for mayor in New York, and they had asked him, you know, what would you do? What would be your first act if you are elected mayor? He said, I'd ask for a recount. So the first thing I do is I'd say, who put me in charge? But beyond that, I think there's at a minimum a 3-pronged approach that the U.S. should be taking right now vis-a-vis the Iranians. Prong 1 is diplomatic. Prong 2 is economic. Prong 3 is in the military domain. Prong 1, diplomatic. 1, you want to make sure that you have no daylight or gray space between you and your partners. That means no daylight or gray space between you and the E3 in Europe, no daylight or gray space between you and the Israelis and you and the GCC states in the Middle East. So working to create like a coordination or a body to make sure that all the messaging on Iran there is the same. Next, on the diplomatic front, referring Iran's nuclear file back to the Board of Governors for an emergency session. Fortunately, the U.S. has already said it would do this before the end of the year if these talks collapse and if Iran doesn't stop impeding the IAEA, and really get that resolution of censure and get it on the books, get it public about how far Iran's nuclear program has gone, about the nature of the violations, and about the impediments to the IAEA mission for monitoring and verification in Iran. So that's step 2. Step 3 is work with your partners in the Joint Commission. This is a body created by the 2015 nuclear deal and is still active based on the lingering participants in that deal to actually escalate the nuclear file and move it back to the Security Council. So using the mechanism of the deal, you can actually collapse the deal on itself. So this means that you can cite the non-compliance matters, debate it, move it to the Security Council, and then collapse UN Security Council Resolution 2231 through this thing called snapback, and in a sense restore the baseline for multilateral pressure against the Islamic Republic that existed at the United Nations actually between 2006 and 2010. And there you have more stringent penalties on Iran and a more stringent baseline from which to operate. That's all diplomatic. Step 2 is
so go ahead.
Sorry about that. It's a lengthy strategy, but I have some views on this. Step 2 is economic. Once you have that diplomatic baseline, you can begin to enforce those existing multilateral sanctions, begin to work with partners such as the UK, which now post-Brexit has an independent sanctions shop. From what we know, Her Majesty's Treasury is the world's second biggest sanctions shop after the US Treasury. There are plenty of opportunities to coordinate nuclear and non-nuclear sanctions. With all the states that don't want to do really tough penalties, they at least have the opportunity under this phase 2 economic pressure policy to go after Tehran's missile program, drone program, human rights violations, terrorism. It doesn't have to be nuclear only. And you want to enforce the penalties that you've received and then keep adding to the stream of pressure through Treasury designations and perhaps even action through Congress. And then lastly, in the military domain, you want to make sure that the Israelis and the Arabs in the region, particularly after Israel was added to CENTCOM, can coordinate more. You want more public military drills. You want to make sure that the U.S. is working overtime with its GCC partners to make sure they have what they need to defend themselves. But also, of course, you want to make sure that the air and missile defenses, particularly the U.S. supplied ones, work, that they're interconnected, that there's early warning radars, that there's sensors and shooters in the region. And you also want to have a more kinetic pushback policy on proxies in places like Iraq and Syria. Every time that they do fire rockets and drones and the U.S. simply absorbs that, that will underwrite the next round of escalation in the future. So taken together, diplomatic, economic, military, this is stuff that can begin to change Iran's calculus and signal to them how serious you are about wanting to negotiate in good faith and not just coming up with these red lines and top lines. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. On the inspection piece, it was 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal saying it was the head of the UN Atomic Watch, the IAEA, saying that they left without failing to come up with some type of plan with inspections. Inspections, how much resistance is Iran currently given to the inspections process?
Oh, goodness. If there's anyone I feel really bad for and my heart goes out to in 2021, it's the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi. This man has worked overtime to go to Tehran several times to find patchwork agreements, to try to get Iran to hold Iran's feet to the fire just a little bit longer, to try to find workarounds to some of Iran's nuclear violations, to do whatever it takes to make even the slightest amount of monitoring and verification that Iran has been rolling back intact. The IAEA has faced numerous challenges in 2021, not only those created in 2021, such as things that the Wall Street Journal has reported, including harassment of female nuclear inspectors inside Iran. This is a story that only got a brief amount of publicity, but I think it's gross, full stop. And of course, the second thing, which is the unanswered questions about the man-made traces, the traces of man-made uranium at 3 different sites from 2020 that the IAEA did not receive a sufficient answer to. So there are lots of things that the regime has done to cut at the eyes and ears and actual inspection capabilities of the IAEA inside Iran. And they're doing this intentionally. They're doing this to slowly put blinders on while growing their program to generate more concerns, to force the West to come to the table and give up everything up front. So all of this is part of a broad and concerted campaign by the Iranians. But someone who's worked overtime to try to fix it is not political in the slightest. He's a technical individual. He's the head of a technical agency, which is a UN body ultimately. He has a narrow mission. He's trying to verify that narrow mission, and he's being impeded by all sides. And that's Rafael Grossi of the IAEA. He's gone to Tehran several times this year to try to keep this monitoring intact. And his pessimism should be a warning for the Biden administration about what is next on the Iran nuclear file.
This is a viewer from Twitter, Jody, saying, does Iran want nuclear capability so badly because it wants to be at the G12 table? It seems everyone there has nuclear capability. They just want to be heard. That seems to be the only way. Adding that nuclear arms got India and Pakistan at the table.
Well, if we're talking about the G7, G8, G12, G20, I believe those are qualified by their economies. But Iran has really shown over the past 4 decades of the Islamic Republic not to prioritize the economy, not to prioritize the national interest, not to prioritize the public good, but really these select asymmetric and unconventional and non-conventional, I should say, military programs like drones, missiles, and this WMD aspirations the regime has. So ultimately, the regime has really decided with its feet and actually voted onto what kind of state it wants to be. It's trying to change the system. It's not trying to rise from within the system. Now, the caller did cite something which I think is important to note in most of the literature on states with nuclear aspirations, and that is the status aspiration, the desire to be seen as a great power or a rising power. And that is certainly driving the Iranian capability. But I would say most of the world's nuclear programs, if not all of them that have weapons dimensions or are weapons programs, are driven by those 2 forces, status and security. And both of them orient and animate the Islamic Republic's nuclear quest today.
From Brian. Brian joins us from Michigan in Oscoda, Republican line. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me, Pedro?
You're on. Go ahead.
All right. So I spent a lot of time in the Middle East to hear a lot of talk, which sounds good, sounds intellectual, nuanced. It's all about supply and demand and what you need in the world. Now, Saudi Arabia is the biggest kingpin in the Middle East. They always have been. They're pretty much in control of OPEC. Trump has proven to the world that if you take our needs part down, which Trump was doing, they will fall in line much better because that's the only real product that they have out of there. We can shut down the whole Persian Gulf at any time that we choose to, but we don't want to do that. You need to deal straight with Saudi Arabia. As Saudi Arabia goes, the Middle East will go on women's rights in particular. There is no reason. Trump has proven to the United States, should have proven to you, that we don't need as much fossil fuel coming out of OPEC as we've been bending over for in the past.
Okay, since you're on with our guest, what would you like him to address specifically?
Well, it's the monetary thing. You talk about economics. No, economics is not number one, and it applies also to China. It's the same thing. You don't deal with people that you should not be dealing with when you have other choices.
Okay, okay, we'll leave it there.
Well, I think the caller is right to point out some of the energy issues and is right to point out the, really, half decade or so of increasing American energy independence, becoming a net exporter, changes to U.S. supply and demand when it comes to things that we have here in the States, things that we actually export, things that give us leverage, as well as, of course, the very helpful Saudi role throughout much of the different periods of the U.S. sanctions regime under Bush, under Obama, and under Trump, in making sure that the markets were still well supplied and other purchasers of Iranian oil had alternatives. So I do see the Saudi Arabia-U.S. connection still acting more in concert than in conflict with one another when it comes to the politics of oil. But the caller mentioned China, which is also very interesting because China, as I'm sure the caller knows, is a hydrocarbon economy, very, very, very dependent on Persian Gulf oil, not just buys from Iran, but buys from other countries in the region. And as the U.S. begins to pivot, or as the U.S. begins to leave or prioritize other theaters, it is going to be exactly these actors, like the Chinese, that are going to be interested in furthering economic ties, furthering political ties, and potentially furthering military ties with those countries in the region.
From Anthony in Pennsylvania, Greentown, Pennsylvania. Good morning, Republican line. Go ahead.
Good morning, Pedro, and good morning to your guest. He's very informative. I appreciate the conversation. The JCPOA was never going to keep Iran from getting nuclear weapons. It was a joke. The inspections criteria were a joke. Nobody was ever going to see their military parts of their nuclear program. 24-hour, 72-hour inspection notices was ridiculous. My question is, if Donald Trump would remain president, where would we be now in the Iranian proliferation of their nuclear weapons? And do they perceive Joe Biden as being super weak and they can get away with anything with this guy? Thank you, sir. Bye.
It's a very interesting question and an interesting counterfactual because, while the Iranians do, at least the Islamic Republic of Iran, I should say, really does paint both sides of the aisle with a broad spectrum, over the past 10 years or so, particularly with their engagement that led up to the JCPOA, they've begun, like many of America's other authoritarian adversaries, the Russians, the Chinese, potentially even the North Koreans, to understand some of the gradations between both sides of the aisle, between isolationist and internationalist, between Republican and Democrat. And they've really tried to flesh that out in some of their policies. So in this counterfactual, we can't say for sure, but we can postulate that Trump would have continued the maximum pressure policy. So to me, that would have been a net benefit. A net minus of the continuation would have been Iran had clearly showed that it was willing to escalate in response to some of this pressure and to try to undercut the pressure policy by creating more risks in the region. If you remember, 2 or 3 times, even in the summer of 2019, the U.S. and Iran almost went to war. So the Trump administration had a very high bar for the use of force in some of these places like Iraq, which was the loss of American life. That high bar is good, but also it means that it may incentivize the adversary to escalate between the price floor and that very high bar. And for that, I think the only real criticism I had of that policy was not that it wasn't effective, it really just didn't have enough time. I do think if you look at Iranian negotiating behavior in the past, a good example is the Iran-Iraq war, for instance. Iran said against its neighbor Iraq, which was fighting this initially defensive and later offensive war during the 1980s, it said war until victory for 7 years, and then in year 8 of the war, the then Supreme Leader Khomeini likened ending the conflict to drinking from a poisoned chalice and accepting a UN ceasefire resolution. So it is possible through pressure to get Iran to settle for a suboptimal solution. I totally think that was the point of the maximum pressure policy. I totally think it was possible. It was really, to me, more a question of when rather than if that engagement would happen. But there also were real concerns around the previous administration about having a sufficient regional pushback. I mentioned places like Iraq, for instance. What was the U.S. really going to do there? That was an open question. And the second was, once negotiations would commence, hypothetically, had there been a term 2 Trump administration, given the number of times that the U.S. president had talked about wanting to very publicly engage Iran, talk about meeting then President Rouhani, what would have happened to those 12 points then? Would they have melted away? Would they have kept? It's really an unknown, to borrow from former Secretary Rumsfeld there. But I think the broad contours is it would have been a question of when, not if, Iran would be engaging in good faith, because even revolutionaries have to respect macroeconomics.
If Monday's discussions are about sanctions primarily, what's the U.S. position, or at least the Biden administration's on sanctions? There was a report in the NPR that in the end of October said they wouldn't lift sanctions until they saw something on Iran when it comes to, taking steps towards, easing back its program. What are the options there? You talked about those avenues of options. If that's the case, what are the options going forward?
Well, just to know where we are moving forward, there has been some informal sanctions relief. For instance, that the U.S. has eased up some of its pressure on Iran's proxies in the region. It removed, for instance, the Houthis from the foreign terrorist organization list. There's legal and political and economic implications of that. There's been several cases pursuant to lawsuits rather than actions directed by the Treasury Department themselves that have taken Iranian entities off of the U.S. sanctions lists. There's been a couple of times due to quote-unquote good sanctions hygiene, but I have some skepticism there that Treasury has delisted Iranian officials. And there's been a whole slew of oil sanctions and illicit oil shipping that could be better enforced. So there has been some informal relief granted by the Biden administration, which has tried to pursue this middle course, which is keep the penalties on the books, but don't actively enforce them. So I think the minimum after Monday, and after however long that session is, 3, 4, 5 days, is to vigorously enforce the penalties that they have inherited, and also do that which was reported in Reuters, I think, yesterday on Thanksgiving or just the day before, depending on where the story was published, which was to call for an extraordinary session of the IAEA Board of Governors, get that resolution of censure, and develop a multilateral baseline for pressure and work with your partners through the UN system to show the Iranians they cannot divide the transatlantic community or any other community like they tried to in the past.
One more call. This will be from Alan in New York, Independent Line.
I just make a brief comment about world white supremacy and domination of the world. The people of color, Africa in the Middle East, and China. The Europeans are looking for world domination, period. And all of these talks about globalism and all of these negotiations is ludicrous, because I'm saying on the mere fact of the matter is that the United States government has proxied Israel to be using gunboat diplomacy in that region. And those people up there trying to fight for their life and their sovereignty as a people.
Okay,
Israel.
That's Alan in New York. Mr. Ben Taleblu.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I would take a pretty sharply different approach to the way the U.S. conducts itself in the region. I have a very different analytical assessment. Therefore, I would respectfully disagree with the caller on that. when you look at the way the Islamic Republic has behaved, its behavior has managed to bring other adversaries together. It's not that the U.S. has somehow been involved in this. You know, I mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, for instance. It's not like the U.S. has harbored some immediate anti-regime tendency as soon as there was an Islamic Republic in 1979. You look at the onset of the Iran-Iraq war, the CIA, for instance, tried to warn Iran that then Saddam's Iraq was arming, moving tanks. You know, the Iranians rebuffed them. There are multiple instances of Iranians missing opportunities here to be able to bridge this gap. This is not a story of, I forget what the caller said, domination or supremacy. This is a story of a regime that has fused Islamism and Marxism and a few other ideologies from the Cold War era, brought it into the current world era, brought it into the 21st century, and wants a revisionist foreign policy and is spending its own nation's blood and treasure to do it.
Again, our guest organization is FDD.org. That's the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam Taleblu serves as a senior fellow. Thanks for joining us. Happy holidays to you.
Pleasure. Thank you.